Okay, let's turn now to look at the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, specifically the section on alienation of labor. We're going to dive a little deeper into this. A widely understood, and accepted part of Marx's analysis, the alienation of labor, focuses on the laborer's systematic dehumanizing conditions that made them part of a human operation where they were just machines, human machines in this factory, and really paid them dirt. So this part of Marx's ideas come from the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. Now, these were only discovered later, after he died, and published in 1932. So you can see the Bolshevik Revolution, which was a major advancement of communism in the modern world in 1917, had already taken place. And so Marxist-Leninist thought was already well solidified by that point. Lenin could be understood to be a kind of hardcore Marxist. In fact, he adds elements to it and hardens up Marxism and pretty much, forever changes that formula. So many Americans, when they think of Marxism, think of Marxist-Leninist thought because it's the most potent form of Marxism. It's, for example, what is in Cuba and North Korea and so forth. And because we struggled against that form of communism so long in the Cold War. But when these came along, and they were discovered and came along in 1932, they kind of changed people's view of Marx. And this younger Marx seemed to be more humanist, kinder and gentler. And so these works rehabilitated interest in Marx in the mid to late 20th century. And hard-nosed, hardcore Marxists tend to ignore them as being his early works that are immature when he was still kind of working things out. So they pay more attention to his later works, Communist Manifesto, and then, of course, Das Kapital. But the idea here in the alienation of labor in these early manuscripts is that humans get pushed out of those old artisanal crafts, such as shoemaking, by industrial society, and then they must sell their self to make a living. Once they're pushed out, once a capitalist has come along and produces some commodity at a really cheap value, in other words, a cheap price, I should say, not value, but a cheap price, well, the old artisans simply can't survive anymore. No one's going to buy their products anymore. And so they wind up being pushed out of their old professions, and all they have to sell is their labor. I mean, it's happened in the agricultural world. I mean, think of it today. I mean, who makes a living as a farmer? It's very, very difficult because industrial-sized production of food or dairy products and so forth and so on is so big that a small farmer simply cannot compete and can't make any money at it. And so we're now in a world where less than 1% of us work in the old agricultural type of professions, okay? And so this happened across the board in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different types of jobs and professions. So industrial production shifts things and pushes people out of their old professions, and now all they have to sell is their self. They're untrained, unskilled labor, okay? Now, what they produce with their labor is going to be divorced from their any kind of organic connection to that labor. So now, I'm not producing a product myself that I have put myself into and that I have pride in, and then I'm going to sell it to someone else in my community that I know, and that's one of the reasons why I'm going to do my work so well, is because I know this person, and I want to do good work for them. I want to have a good reputation as well. All that's stripped away. I mean, it's like, I have no idea who made any of these clothes that I'm wearing right now. They were made on the other side of the world, probably, for all I know. I haven't even bothered to check where they were made, okay? And so it is with all the products that we have. It's very rare for us to buy something from someone who made it. And so this begins to destroy communal connections. Our normal type of intertwined, interlocked type of economic activities where I do something for you, you do something for somebody else, and then that person does something for me, and we're all kind of interlocked in a kind of service or a commodity world, that's just completely gone. So many people feel today, we live in a world that's so socially disjointed and disconnected, we don't feel like there's any community anymore, and this is one of the reasons, okay? And so this is, for example, I would say in my own assessment, why some people today want to buy local. They want to buy from a local farm or something like that. There are a few restaurants around that's part of their whole agenda, is to only buy local products and so forth and build back these community connections, almost as a trying to restore something that was lost hundreds of years ago. But anyway, so as the labor, as a laborer is alienated from the product that he makes, he only gets a subsistence wage, and he spirals down into poverty, and all he has to sell him is himself. Marx is going to see this whole process as essentially one of enslavement. We don't call it that, but functionally it's a type of enslavement. So the capitalist, the person who owns the factory and who's making money, only sees value in profit. They don't really see much value in human capital. They don't see much value in the organic community connections anymore. And they're not really interested in the interpersonal economic dependence that I've just been referring to. So economics becomes all about the money with no human interest. The masses are impoverished and oppressed and, yes, functionally enslaved. There are many varieties of Marxism, okay? I've already mentioned the Marxist-Leninist version, and is probably the most potent. And that, of course, heralded and triumphed by Lenin and Stalin, okay? But there's also Maoism. But there are also philosophical versions like we see in Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialist philosopher. It's kind of an existentialist Marxism. But early Marx, this early Marx that we've been looking at is a humanist. It's the softer side of Marx, if you will. It's some would say a kind of a Marxism light. The later Marx is far more militant, far more demanding, looking for a kind of violent revolution in which this conflict between the classes will end in a violent clash. And ultimately, a totalitarian state will run the economy. Now, you look at most of the places in the world that we consider to be communist today, China, North Korea, Cuba, and so forth. And yes, you do wind up with a kind of totalitarian state. There are many real-world examples, both of the past and of the present, that we could look at. And so, from the USSR to North Korea. But the kinder, softer, gentler Marx is often heralded by people who kind of lean towards something we might call democratic socialism here in the West. And the idea here is that these Marxist-minded individuals advocate for a kind of democracy that votes its way steadily through the political process, the democratic political process, votes its way steadily towards more socialist solutions instead of a full-bore communist solution like Mao and Stalin and those guys, okay? So next we'll look at some of the historical theory that lies in Marxist thinking. Now here's the kind of the Marxist narrative, okay? There's an evolution of societies through time, and the kinds of economic bases that those societies had are going to be the foundation that drives everything in that society's culture, including its government, the laws, the customs, and even the religion, the art, perhaps, even the music and so forth, okay? So let's kind of go back and look at some possible examples of this, all right? Let's go all the way back in history to, say, 10,000 BC, okay? Back to the hunter-gatherer stage of human development. Now, in a hunter-gatherer stage of human development, there are no vast societies or governments or anything. Human beings live in rather small groups, say 20, 25 people, okay? A father and and the mother with a few children and maybe a brother and a sister and so forth and so on. A small little group of people. In such a society, what is the basis of production? In other words, what is it that people do to get the stuff they need to live? Well, they have to go out and gather. That's why they're called hunters and gatherers. They have to go out and hunt, and they have to gather, nuts and berries, and maybe every once in a while they get some eggs or something like that from a wild, some type of a wild bird or something like that. Or maybe they catch, a wild animal and are able to eat some meat occasionally. But you can see here that this type of existence is one that requires a lot of work. Every person has to get out there and collect their own food. And so you wind up with a kind of egalitarian culture because everyone pretty much has to pull their own weight. And there might be an emerging head within this culture, like a father figure that someone looks to, someone who is kind of like the head of the clan or this little group or something like that. But you don't need a complex government here, okay? Things can be discussed between each of the group, members of the group, and decisions can be made and so forth. But for the most part, each person has, relatively the same amount of power as the other people, as long as they're adults. Now, what kind of religion would go with such a worldview like that, such an existence like that? And this is what Marx is saying, is that man makes religion. Religion doesn't make man, okay? And so we create, if we lived in such a situation, and we had been there for many generations, we would probably have something that is kind of animistic in our approach to religion. That is, we would see ourselves in harmony with nature. We're taking what we can from it, but not too much. And we want to respect the world. We would see everything in the world as having a little bit of agency, and so that is some type of a spirit, if you will. So we would tend to be animistic. We may, later on, as we grew, become a little more polytheistic, that is, seeing many gods, okay? Now, let's zoom up a couple of thousand years, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years, to an agricultural economy. By that time, after this many thousands of years, people have figured out you can take those little berries and nuts and plant them, and more will grow, and you can make your life a lot better by growing food. And so now the economy is one that is shifted towards agriculture, but you have to change your values now, okay? You have to change your values because now a possession of land is important because, well, to grow crops, you have to have a piece of land that you develop, you cultivate, you get the rocks out, you till the soil, and so forth and so on. And some land is better than others for this. And so a possession of land becomes important. Well, to have records of possession of land, you now need more management, you need more government, okay? You need an expanding hierarchy, someone who has control over or keeps track of who has what, okay, and how to keep track of land and how to mark land and so forth and so on. So you can see society has to get more complex now. Moreover, with more food, you make more people, okay? With more food, you get more babies and bigger families. The next thing you know, you have 50, 100,000 people to manage. And this is a lot different scenario. Well, now, you see, not only do you have a different hierarchical structure in society, you now have a different type of religion, he would say. Maybe you move to a henotheistic type of religion. Henotheistic is kind of like Zeus and all the smaller gods. Zeus was the top god, but there were smaller gods underneath him, okay? Not exactly polytheism, but it's in between polytheism and monotheism. The next stage. Maybe as those agricultural communities grow far more complex, up into maybe 1 million people, now you need a monotheistic religion because you're going to have someone at the top who has the authority. And this was the natural way for human beings to organize themselves, was in a monotheistic type of fashion. And so a monotheistic religion went with it. Why? Well, the person who was in control of the society would have a special connection to this one singular God. And that would give that person special powers. The king or the emperor, so to speak, would have special powers and be looked at as being a connection between the people and the God. Now, move up to a mercantilist type of economy where vast people groups around the world are starting to trade with each other, okay? And now you need something like the modern nation state that emerges during the Renaissance, okay? Monarchy is still a good type of system for this, but what's going to eventually emerge out of that is a kind of a deist conception, more pluralistic, okay? Then you get up to Marx's age, where you have industrial type of economy. Now, the way people get what they need is through industrial production, okay? We've come a long way. And so now, the type of government that you need has shifted. Now you need social contract legislation. You need, and so in a mercantilist capitalist economy, the day that Marx was in, who controlled the legislation? Well, it was the people who had the money, okay. And so you see how what Marx is saying is the whole superstructure of society, this is what he called it, the whole superstructure, that would be the government, the laws that the government makes, the cultural products, the art, the philosophy, and the religion. All of this stuff is kind of grows out of the soil of the economy. And this is a very distinctive Marxist insight. And till this day, this is the way many people interpret the world. It's the material basis of society that drives everything else, okay? When you get to a kind of a late industrial economy and a post-industrial economy, Marx would say that what is best is going to be a communist structure, a communist superstructure with no religion, a kind of an a-religious society, a secular world, okay, which is kind of where we are today, all right? Now, that's just a big general interpretation of all of human history, but all along that stage from the hunter-gatherer up to the agricultural and so forth, all the way down to where we are today, there's a struggle there between people who have property and have goods and have wealth and those who don't, okay? So any aspect of society or culture, including its religion, is part of this superstructure built upon the substructure of the economy. The economy rules, okay? Follow the money. This is the idea. All of this is the base of production, okay? Economic production, the means of eking out a living, the day-to-day living, is what creates the conditions from which a culture and a society, its governments and laws, religion and art will be built. Now, let's move on to the concept of the opiate of the masses. This is one of Marx's most famous statements, and it comes from one of our readings here, Toward a Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. He says, quote, "Man makes religion. Religion does not make man. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, as it is the spirit of a spiritless conditions. It is the opium of the people," or the opiate of the masses, a more common translation. Now, Marx was really good at turning phrases. At one time, he hoped to be a romantic poet, and he wrote a lot of poetry and so forth and so on. And Shakespeare was one of his favorite authors and so forth. Marx consumed a lot of the high culture of his day. And so Marx was very good at using language and turning phrases, and that's why you see a lot of memorable things that he says in all of his writings, and this certainly is one of those. The idea here is that at best, on Marx's analysis, at best, religion just manifests the plight of the poor. Religion is kind of like a lament that people have. They're longing for a better situation, and religion is simply a way to imagine that, okay? But at worst, religion stands in the way of their liberation from oppression, okay? Religion enables a kind of false consciousness. And what is false consciousness? This is a concept that Marx developed, and you still hear it referred to today sometimes. This is when a person buys into and believes in a system of thought that's really designed to undermine them. They buy into it. This would be like a slave in the Old South believing that slavery was a good system, a good social system, and so forth and so on. Okay? They've bought into that which is oppressing them. But, you know, false consciousness, at least for Marx, religion is part of that false consciousness. So religion is a kind of altered consciousness as well. It's a type of intoxication. People are intoxicated with the concept of heaven, with dreaming about heaven, longing for heaven, but it doesn't change anything here. You know, you've probably heard the old saying that someone is too heavenly minded to be any earthly good. Well, what happens when you get a whole population of people like that who are intoxicated with heaven to the point that you can't get them to make any changes in their actual physical world around them? That's what Marx is talking about here, being the opiate of the masses. So Marx doesn't really attack religion that much, and neither does he really deal with the whole question of the existence of God. He just kind of assumes atheism and then moves on with his project. He gets atheism from other thinkers like Feuerbach, and so he feels like, well, I don't really have to start with that. I've got other fish to fry here. And for him, his interpretation is the economy is everything. Economy drives everything. Then that's what we need to focus on. And so he's not really interested in talking about the existence of God or anything like that. Okay. And so one of the most revealing quotes that he says is this: "The criticism of religion ends with the doctrine that man is the highest end for man. Hence, with the categorical imperative to overthrow all conditions in which man is degraded, enslaved, neglected, and a contemptible being." So the idea here is that the most operative part of that whole quote is this: man is the highest end for man. So what we have here is a type of humanism, but it's a secular humanism. It's almost like an isolated humanism, that we can make ourselves better, we can improve our lot in this life, we can change ourselves, and we can change our very nature. Because, well, this is a post-Darwinist age. Well, at least Darwin emerges during the exact same time. And Marx so liked Darwin's ideas that he wanted to dedicate his magnum opus, Das Kapital, to Darwin. And Darwin kind of declined, but I'm not sure if he did anyway, but he really wanted to devote or to dedicate his magnum opus to Darwin. But the idea here is that there's kind of an extreme humanism. The point is that we don't need to look to anything else for our advancement, for progress. We have what we need. We have our own tools. We have agency in this world. We have natural resources that we can pull upon. And so we don't need to look to some transcendent being. We don't need to look to religion to make our life better and so forth and so on. What we need to do is to change that economic base, all right, so that everyone can be happy. And so the whole idea of someone who today, in this current age that we're in now, someone who is a progressive, what do they mean by the term progressive? They mean that they think that human beings can progress, improve the human lot in life, but also can improve human nature. And so it is a type of humanism. We're far beyond Renaissance humanism or Christian humanism that we looked at way back at the beginning. Okay. And so here it is a kind of scientific humanism, sometimes called secular humanism. Some contemporary thinkers would call it exclusive humanism. Okay. Now let's talk about Hegelian dialectic. Hegel, a very important thinker, early 19th century, he emerges in the post-Kantian world. Kant died in 1804. Hegel emerges kind of in the wake of this. Kant was a transcendental idealist. Hegel is what we would call an absolute idealist. Now I know there's a lot of big philosophical words here, and so I'm going to try to share with you a little bit of what Hegel taught, just so you can understand how Marx, a Hegelian, borrows concepts from Hegel. Okay. Now when Marx was a young student, he fell under the influence of two philosophers. The first was Hegel, and Marx is a Hegelian, but a particular brand of Hegelian. But he will modify Hegel's system and Hegel's thought by abandoning the spiritual or the immanence of God and retaining Hegel's dialectic method. Now, Hegel called himself an absolute idealist, and that God is an absolute spirit. So God isn't a transcendent being who lives outside this world, who creates the world, and the world is independent of God, or that is, the world is not God. No, what this world is, according to Hegel, it is God. Now, this isn't a pantheism. This will be what we would call a panentheism. The idea being that everything in this world is an outworking of God's rational ideas. As Hegel said, the rational is the real and the real is the rational. He's an idealist. What do idealists think? They think that rational ideas are more real than the physical world. Okay? In fact, you could destroy all kinds of things in this physical world. You could destroy the physical world altogether, and the most real thing still exists, and that's rationality. Okay? So he's a panentheist, which he says that God is this absolute spirit, but God is evolving. God is morphing, if you will. God is expanding out, and we are part of that. Our brain, our rationality, if you will, is a manifestation of this, an extension of this. But the highest forms of God's absolute spirit working itself out in the world are art, philosophy, and politics. And Hegel, being a thoroughgoing German that he was, guess which form of politics he thought was the highest form of or not only human development, but of the absolute spirit. The cutting edge of the absolute spirit was the German state. Okay? So you can see a little rumblings of 20th century German culture beginning here. The idea that the German state, the German culture, was the cutting edge of God in the universe. And so, Hegel's ideas are quite potent in a lot of ways. For example, Hegel's followers are later going to split into two wings, a left wing and a right wing, okay? And Marx is going to be part of the left wing. He's a part of a group called the Young Hegelians. But Marx will take Hegel's concept of this evolving dialectic entity, the absolute spirit, and Marx will strip out all the spirit, but keep the dialectic. Now, what does he put in the place of the spirit? Feuerbach's materialism. So now the whole world is an outworking of a flow of, an evolution, if you will, of the material order of material things in the world, including the human being. So this is often called a dialectical materialism, all right? And I know that too is a big word, but it's a view of the world that is material, that is working itself out in this kind of flow of opposing forces. Sometimes, just to help you here, this is called thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, where the thesis emerges, the antithesis arises, they clash, and out of it comes a synthesis. That is an oversimplification of what Hegel said, but it does kind of help you begin to understand what Hegel said. But Marx says that this thesis and antithesis now is bourgeoisie, proletariat, and classless society, okay? So, or the rich and the poor, and a radical communist, utilitarian, kind of egalitarian society that will come out, all right? Now, Hegel's followers, like I said, split into right wing and left wing. The right wing was conservative, and the left wing were the economic materialists like Marx, okay? Now, it's often said that on the battlefields of Stalingrad in World War II, which was a decisive battle between Russia and Germany at the end of World War II, a battle of epic proportions where hundreds of thousands of people died, men in battle died. It was said that on that battlefield, the right wing and the left wing Hegelians met in battle, that Hegel's students met on the battlefield in World War II. The right held that history was an inexorable force of God unfolding in human history, and especially through the leadership of key political men like Hitler, okay? The left-wingers, these would be the Russians, were the Leninists, who held that economics drives history, not people, okay? And so, interesting observation there, and you will occasionally hear that quoted. The dialectic is an interplay of opposing forces or ideas, and sometimes, like I said, called thesis and antithesis following into a synthesis. Marx will emphasize the physicality of the material forces in the world. And at some point in history, these forces will interpenetrate each other and cancel each other out while preserving each other. In a kind of a new outcome will emerge, sometimes called the synthesis will emerge. Now let me just see if I can give you an illustration of what that might look like in our world, okay? Now just imagine with me, if you can, the U.S. Congress, okay? As you know, the Congress is dominated by two parties, Republicans and Democrats, and they are kind of like mortally opposed to each other. They never vote with each other anymore. And so they kind of are forces that oppose each other. Now just imagine, I know this is going to take a lot of imagination, but just imagine that these two forces oppose each other in Congress to the point that they escalate. And in their escalation, it becomes obvious that nothing is going to ever get done or ever get resolved. And so within the clash, a new type of mentality emerges within perhaps the members of Congress who finally come together and say, what we really want to preserve is this part of the Democratic agenda. This is really what is important. And the Republicans do the same thing. And so they start to come together to emphasize what they both believe in. And they leave behind what they don't agree on. They leave behind the elements that the extreme parts of their party, the extreme wings of those parties hold to. So now you have a third thing that has emerged. And this is the synthesis. This is the canceling out of the extreme parts and the preservation of the moderate overlapping parts. And that goes on to become a third thing, a third identity all its own. They come up with a new name for this group, and it eventually becomes a third party. What happens to the previous two parties, the old Democrats and the old Republicans? Well, they kind of wither away. And so that's what that's what he's talking about here. That would be a dialectic process, okay? So we can only hope that something like that may happen someday. But anyway, Marx agrees that the history of the world proceeds in a kind of this dialectical zigzag. The whole history of the world moves in these dialectical moves. Hegel called these moments, and that he looked back through history and saw this as a march of ideas. Marx doesn't see it as ideas at all. Marx sees it as material forces, classes, haves and have-nots. So there's a fundamental difference here. Marx takes Hegel and turns him on his head, he said. Marx and Engels held that they stood Hegel on his head. That is, they switched Hegel around. They got rid of that spiritual gobbledygook and put in its place material forces, okay? And so, thus, dialectical materialism. Hegel is the dialectic, Feuerbach is the materialistic, and they welded it together into a new system. So for Marx, the whole flow of history arises from the material basis again. The economic conditions from which humans strive to survive. Remember, the hunters and gatherers, the agrarian, the mercantilists, and the industrial, each had a different base. And therefore, they had different types of government, even different types of religion. So ideas arise from this soil, not vice versa, as Hegel held, and as most past philosophers held as well. I mean, I teach history of ideas, and I love the flow of ideas in the world and how they emerged and so forth and so on. But Marx would say that this evolutionary sequence of ideas isn't something that just flows on top of culture or something that drives culture itself. He would say, au contraire, it arises from the history of the economic and material activity. So it's kind of a secondary thing. What's really important is the economy. You may have heard of Richard Weaver's famous essay called Ideas Have Consequences. He would definitely object to what Marx is saying here. A fairly small book, one that you might want to read sometime, very interesting. But Marx would have retorted to Weaver that economic conditions have consequences. And that's it. I mean, pretty much the economic conditions are what drive all of the consequences of culture. Every aspect of the culture, government, the very laws, and on it goes, all the way down to the religion. This is perhaps Marx's most enduring legacy for those who really don't accept his political conditions, or his political solutions. Most of us as Americans, myself included, don't accept his political solutions, that is revolution and classless society, abolition of private property, and so forth and so on. Some people do, obviously. There's a very strong leftist part of our culture today. But even if you don't accept that, some Marxist analysis, that is that these economic conditions drive a great deal of the way a particular culture constructs itself, is a prescient insight. The means and modes of human economy drive and power the culture instead of the opposite. So now, what conclusions can we draw? I'm going to kind of wrap things up here and see if we can look at some implications as well. Marx's analysis and solutions to socio-political issues deeply resonate with many people around the world, not just here in the U.S. There are Marxist movements of many different flavors around the world. Socialism is kind of a lighter form of Marxism, if you will. I mean, it's not a full-blown situation where the state owns every industry and owns all private property. Some private property is owned by some property is owned by private individuals, but in a socialistic scenario, in some way or another, the government derives a great deal of the income, the profits from those industries. But the communist movement itself, full-blown, full-bore communism, is a global movement. You can't really understand 20th century politics and geopolitics without it. The whole Cold War was a kind of struggle between Western liberal democracy and Soviet communism. And they had the whole globe pretty much locked down, if you will. And you had proxy wars that were going on, like Vietnam. There were in Afghanistan and other places. There were wars between the United States and the Soviet Union, but not directly, kind of indirectly. That's what happened in Korea as well, and how we wound up with North Korea and South Korea. And so you can't understand 20th century. Like I said, you can't understand the globe today without understanding communism and how it emerged and how it took over great parts of the world. But today there is something known as a kind of a democratic version of socialism, which tries to incorporate some of Marx's critiques to try to improve the wages and the life of the laborer. I mean, capitalism itself, or capitalist economies like the United States itself, were transformed by some of these leftist ideas. So the rise of the welfare state, all kinds of labor laws and all kinds of things to protect people and laborers and so forth and so on, including all types of socialist programs that we have in our society, come from that wing of political thought. So, but there are many competing visions of Marxism out there, and many conflicts even about what Marx said and what he really intended to say. But they all share Marx's explosive thesis about economic history driving everything. Marx approaches humanities' problems differently than anyone before him. And he sees our social struggles arising from the economic conditions that drive our entire culture. So he doesn't really concern himself with some of the old classic issues in philosophy, such as epistemology, metaphysics, and so forth, or even ethics for that matter, as do other philosophers. And so often a lot of contemporary philosophers don't even really think of Marx as a philosopher at all. They think of him as a political thinker, okay? But Marx is striving to create a complete scientific economic solution to humanity's entire existential crisis. And the bulk of that existential crisis, he would say, is the poor and all the implications that poverty brings with it. The lack of education, health care, on and on it goes, okay? And so he's trying to come up with a complete solution to that. Now, Marx does believe that human nature evolves. Most political thinkers and other philosophers, myself included, would say that human nature is constant. That if you found a human being from 10,000 years ago, the basic things that order and operate in that human being's life are really no different than my own, in the sense that I'm a human being, that's a human being, and there's a great deal of constant nature there between us. But Marx doesn't see that. Marx is much more Darwinian in this sense, and he believes that human beings, human nature itself is changing and evolving. It isn't fixed. So he has little reason to think that human nature is constant, being a materialist. In the material world, everything is kind of in flux and changing. And so he too thinks that human beings are changing. We're malleable. We can be improved. We can be engineered. This is this type of extreme humanism. We can improve ourselves. And we can engineer ourselves even through science. So Marx holds that by changing the economic conditions that we live in, we change our nature. And in a way, there really is no nature. The nature is up to us. What we are is up to us. He says, quote, "All history is nothing but the continuous transformation of human nature." So nature implies something that's fixed, but he still has to use that word to imply that there's nothing fixed in the human being. Humanity is evolving. We're morphing, if you will. And what we are is going to be the result of the decisions we make along the way and how we organize ourselves. But eventually, this transformation should reach a classless society. There's an end to history for Marx. This is why sometimes it's called a utopian philosophy. There is an end where oppression ends, and no one is oppressed according to class or wealth or education or anything like that. And he even held that at some point all states would wither away. There would be no need for government anymore. The state would wither away and nations themselves would dissolve. Engels' funeral oration in 1883, Engels says, quote, "Just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development in human history. The simple fact, hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology, that mankind must first of all eat, drink, and have shelter and clothing before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc." So you see there, Engels is basically stating the kernel, the nut of what Marx's enduring legacy will be. And that is all of that higher superstructure that we so often pay attention to, politics, culture, art, all that stuff, religion included, all of that is built upon how we make a living, the economy. So when the modes of production, that is, when the way to earn a living shifts, so do social relations. And this is going on even now, as we are right now in the late stages of another revolution, the information revolution. Just as the Industrial Revolution gave us clothing, ample food, and so forth and so on, so the Information Revolution has made us awash in knowledge. And so, some of us who are a little older have watched this. We've seen that, we went from a world where if you wanted to know something, you had to go to a library. Now you whip out your smartphone and you ask Siri, okay, or you Google it or something like that. Information is at your fingertips. In fact, a flood, an ocean of information is at your fingertips. And so the information revolution has flooded us with all kinds of knowledge, just as the Industrial Revolution flooded us with all kinds of goods, okay? So this too has changed social dynamics, often in subtle ways because it doesn't happen rapidly, but it does have an intersection with our culture, with our politics, and the way we interact with individuals. It has even changed the way we see religion and so forth. Just for example, reflect on the way that we have changed in the past 10 years due to ubiquitous social media. I mean, the iPhone is just barely 10 years old. And so the social media revolution that came has transformed the way we interact with each other, not just online, but in the real world and so forth and so on. And so what I'm trying to get you to understand here is that shifts in the modes of production, we're now in an information economy, if you will, but we're in the late stages of it. Shifts in the way we produce and make a living have shifted the way that we interact up on all these other superstructure endeavors of the human experience. So that kind of gets into some of the implications. But here are the long-lasting implications. Marx is not going to go away. Marxist analysis is here to stay. And because there is something fruitful that comes from it. You can do Marxist analysis without being a communist or being technically a Marxist. In some ways, Marx himself said, I'm not going there. I'm not a Marxist, which is kind of interesting. How could Marx not be a Marxist? But he was not willing to go to the lengths that some people were willing to go with his ideas. But here are some other implications to think about. As long as there are enormous populations of people who are deeply impoverished in some way, some form of Marxist thought will thrive. In any of Marx's assessment of history, his mode of analysis corresponds to the world. In other words, if his mode of analysis has any truth to it, if it corresponds to the world, his ideas will inspire the powerless masses who only have their size as an asset. In other words, their numbers are their chief asset. The human spirit longs for liberation, liberation from poverty, and all the myriad complications that comes from poverty that oppresses us. And so wherever there are people who feel oppressed, and wherever there are people who are seeking liberty, Marx's ideas will hold out some hope for them, and they will find inspiration in it, I feel. Now, where they go with that, how they apply it, many different experiments there on that. Perhaps we should end with the epitaph on Marx's tomb, which I think is very indicative of his whole philosophy. He said, quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, but the point is to change it."